There comes a time in a person's evolution when silence becomes more sacred than conversation, solitude more nourishing than company, and presence more powerful than participation. Not because you've grown cold or detached, but because something within you has awakened, something ancient, something divine, something that no longer tolerates the noise of what is shallow. It's not arrogance, it's alignment. It's not misanthropy, it's mastery. It's the natural consequence of spiritual awakening, the phase when the awakened soul begins to withdraw from the constant intrusion of unawakened energy. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what he didn't say is that this privilege comes with a cost: isolation, not the loneliness of being unloved, but the solitude of being unseen. Because the more awake you become, the less you can pretend. And the less you can pretend, the fewer places you can hide. You begin to notice that the spaces you used to feel comfortable in now drain you. The conversations that once entertained you now exhaust you. The relationships that once felt familiar now feel foreign. It's not that people have changed, it's that you have. Your frequency has shifted. Your energy has become sharper, clearer, cleaner. And now you can feel everything. You can feel when someone speaks from authenticity and when they speak from ego. You can feel when a room is charged with truth and when it's suffocating under pretense. You can feel when someone's smile is genuine and when it's camouflage for pain. This sensitivity, this expansion of perception, is both a gift and a burden, because awakening doesn't make you superior, it makes you more porous. You begin to absorb energies the way the ocean absorbs rain without choice. And that's why the spiritually awake don't like visitors. Not because they've grown antisocial or bitter, but because they've grown aware. Aware that every interaction is an exchange of energy. Aware that most people don't come to connect, they come to consume. They come with unresolved wounds, unconscious projections, chaotic frequencies. They come wanting to be filled, but not wanting to be healed. When you reach that level of awareness, you stop entertaining everyone who knocks on your door. You start guarding your energy the way a sovereign guards their kingdom, because you understand that your peace is not a public park, it's a temple, and not everyone is meant to walk barefoot in it. You used to feel guilty for saying no. You used to apologize for needing space. But awakening teaches you that boundaries are not walls, they are filters. They are not about keeping people out, but about keeping your soul pure. Jung once said that solitude is for those who have learned how to be with themselves. And when you finally awaken, you realize how few people have. Most people can't stand silence because it confronts them with their own emptiness. They fill it with chatter, distraction, constant noise, because stillness terrifies them. Stillness exposes the cracks in the psyche. Stillness whispers truths that the ego has spent years trying to drown. But the awakened soul has made peace with that stillness. It doesn't run from the mirror anymore. It has sat with its own shadow long enough to recognize its reflection in others. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. You start to notice how many people live asleep, speaking words that aren't theirs, chasing desires they didn't choose, living lives that were programmed into them. You start to realize that most people don't want to wake up. They want to dream more comfortably. And so you withdraw, not out of judgment, but out of compassion. Because you understand that every attempt to awaken someone prematurely is violence. You can't drag someone into consciousness. You can only embody it so powerfully that it calls to them when they're ready. That's why the awakened spend so much time alone. Solitude becomes their sanctuary, their classroom, their cathedral. It's where they recharge, recalibrate, and remember who they are beyond the noise. Because the more you evolve, the more energy it takes just to be in the world. You start to crave depth, authenticity, simplicity. You can no longer tolerate superficial conversation, transactional relationships, performative spirituality, your tolerance for inauthenticity evaporates. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation, the process of becoming whole by integrating all that you are. It requires solitude because it's not a social activity, it's an alchemical one. You must descend into the underworld of your own psyche, confront your shadows, make peace with your contradictions. And this descent cannot be done in crowds. It demands silence, reflection, confrontation with the unknown. When you come back from that descent, you are no longer the same. You carry a kind of light that others can sense but not understand. It's not the soft light of naivety, it's the fierce light of awareness. And that light makes people uncomfortable. Because when you walk into a room with that kind of energy, it exposes everything false in it. It reveals the masks, the pretenses, the unspoken tension. You don't even have to say a word, your presence does it for you. That's why the spiritually awake seem distant. They're not rejecting people, they're respecting vibration. They're not avoiding others, they're preserving alignment. Because they know that one careless conversation can derail days of inner work. One interaction with the wrong energy can scatter the stillness they've spent weeks cultivating. And once you've tasted that stillness, once you've felt what real peace feels like, you protect it with everything you have. The awake don't need company to feel complete. They are company to themselves. They don't seek validation because they've met truth. They don't chase love because they are love. Their solitude is not loneliness, it's sovereignty. It's not isolation, it's insulation from chaos. In solitude, they hear what most people miss. They hear the voice of intuition, the language of symbols, the guidance of the unconscious. They start to notice synchronicities, the universe speaking in patterns, numbers, dreams, and coincidences too precise to be random. Jung called it synchronicity, the bridge between the inner world and the outer world. And to the awakened, this becomes their primary form of communication. They don't need constant noise because they've learned to converse with existence itself. That's why visitors become unsettling. Not because the awake despise people, but because the unawakened bring noise that interrupts dialogue with the divine. They bring distraction when the awakened are listening for direction. They bring small talk when the soul is engaged in silence. And so the awake becomes selective, not out of elitism, but necessity. They start valuing energy over entertainment, presence over personality, truth over comfort. They no longer open their doors to everyone, because not everyone comes in peace. Some come with projection, envy, and unresolved wounds, and the awakened can feel it instantly. Because when you've cleaned your inner world, you can't ignore someone else's chaos. You can feel the dissonance like static in the air. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do is close the door. This withdrawal is misunderstood by many. People will call you cold, detached, arrogant. They'll say you've changed, and they're right. But what they don't understand is that awakening is not about becoming better than others. It's about becoming more yourself. It's about shedding everything that isn't real until only truth remains. And truth has its own gravity. It doesn't chase. It attracts. It doesn't shout. It resonates. It doesn't need validation. It simply is. When you start living from that truth, you realize that you no longer need to be surrounded by people to feel alive. You need silence, nature, light, breath. You begin to find beauty in simplicity, meaning in stillness, fulfillment in presence. And the irony is, the more you let go of needing company, the more powerful your presence becomes. People will begin to feel drawn to you, even if they don't understand why, because the one who no longer seeks energy becomes the one who radiates it. That's why those who are spiritually awake guard their solitude so fiercely. It's not to escape humanity, but to preserve the humanity within themselves. It's not to reject connection, but to refine it. They will choose one conversation of truth over 100 of noise. They will choose the quiet of the forest over the clamor of applause, because they've realized that in silence they hear God, and that is why the awakened don't like visitors, because they've built temples within themselves, and not everyone who knocks on the door comes to pray. And when the awakened one learns this, they stop apologizing for their absence. They stop explaining why they disappear, why they withdraw, why they move like ghosts through a world that once held them captive. Because they understand now not everyone is meant to walk with you through the stillness. Not everyone is meant to breathe in the air that silence creates. There are frequencies that can only exist in solitude. There are truths that only reveal themselves when no one else is watching. When you awaken, you begin to see the invisible architecture of energy, the threads between words, the vibrations beneath intentions, the weight of every interaction. You start to feel how energy lingers after people leave, how some presences bless a room and others stain it. You learn that peace is not passive, it's a discipline. You begin to cleanse yourself of conversations that leave you hollow, of interactions that dim your light, because awareness has made you sensitive, but sensitivity has made you sacred. Carl Jung spoke often of individuation, the process of becoming whole through the integration of your inner opposites. And that process cannot occur in noise. It happens in the quiet furnace of solitude, where the conscious mind finally meets the unconscious, where you come face to face with your shadow not as an enemy, but as a teacher. And once you've seen the truth of your own darkness, you no longer tolerate people who refuse to see theirs. You no longer have patience for projection. You no longer engage in arguments that circle endlessly around denial, because you know, the moment you wake up, you lose the luxury of pretending. The spiritually awake don't dislike people. They dislike performance. They don't avoid connection. They avoid contamination. They've learned that not every invitation deserves acceptance. Not every conversation deserves a response. And not every energy deserves access. They have become custodians of consciousness. They treat their peace as priests treat relics, with reverence, with ritual, with restraint. When visitors come, when people approach with chaos disguised as curiosity, with envy dressed as admiration, with wounds masquerading as warmth, the awakened one feels it immediately. Their intuition fires before logic can interfere. They sense it in the tone, the eyes, the unspoken hunger. They sense when someone comes to take instead of exchange. And without hostility, without judgment, they simply step aside. They no longer fight the intrusion. They flow around it, because protection, for them, is now energetic, not defensive. This is the point where many feel misunderstood. Those who have not awakened mistake boundaries for distance, quiet for pride, selectivity for rejection. But the truth is, awakening changes your geometry. Your circle shrinks, but your depth expands. Your words become fewer, but they carry weight. Your presence becomes rarer, but it becomes medicine. You start to see that your solitude isn't isolation, it's incubation. It's where your soul regenerates, where your insights ripen, where your energy recalibrates. You spend more time with nature because nature vibrates without deceit. The trees don't lie. The ocean doesn't pretend. The moon doesn't need attention to shine. And that authenticity becomes your home. Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." And once you've looked inside deeply enough, the external world loses its hypnotic pull. You no longer chase approval. You no longer seek belonging in the herd, because you realize true belonging is not found among people, it's found in presence. You belong to existence itself, and that realization is both freeing and terrifying. It liberates you from dependence. but it exiles you from the ordinary. You will find yourself walking alone often. You will find the crowds louder, the conversations shallower, the ambitions emptier. But you will also find beauty in the smallest details, the sound of wind through leaves, the rhythm of breath, the miracle of being aware. You will find a level of peace that feels almost unearthly, not because life is easier, but because you are no longer resisting it. The spiritually awake withdraw because they have learned the cost of constant exposure. Energy, like water, must be contained to maintain its clarity. If it's poured out endlessly into unhealed spaces, it becomes murky, depleted, directionless, and so they retreat to purify, to replenish, to remember. They become guardians of their vibration, knowing that what they carry can heal or can harm depending on how it's used. This is not loneliness, it's refinement. It's the shedding of unnecessary attachments, the pruning of energetic cords that once fed confusion. The more you awaken, the more you realize. Silence is not emptiness, it's full of everything that matters. It holds the answers, the intuitions, the visions. It's where the self speaks through symbols, dreams, synchronicities. It's where your higher consciousness begins to guide the personality that once wandered lost. And in that stillness, you finally understand something profound. You were never meant to be constantly available. You were meant to be intentional. You were meant to offer your presence as a sacred act, not as a reflex. Because presence is power. And power, when unconscious, creates chaos. But power, when consecrated, becomes healing. That's why the spiritually awake protect their space. It's not to exclude the world, it's to elevate it. They know that the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more frequency. It doesn't need more talk. It needs more transmission. And transmission only flows from a vessel that's been emptied, purified, and quieted. So when you see an awakened soul sitting alone, understand they are not lonely. They're listening. They're tuning in to the rhythm beneath all rhythms, the silence that hums beneath sound, the divine signal that most people have forgotten how to hear. And in that listening, they are repairing the collective vibration, one moment of awareness at a time. This is the paradox of awakening. It isolates you from the surface, but connects you to the source. You withdraw from people, but you merge with presence. You lose the crowd, but you gain communion with the cosmos. And once you've tasted that communion, small talk feels like static. Only silence feels like home. That is why the spiritually awake do not like visitors. Not because they lack love, but because they love too deeply to waste it. Not because they hate humanity, but because they understand its fragility. Not because they reject connection, but because they have found the kind that requires no words. The kind that happens between soul and source, between stillness and creation, between awareness and eternity. They don't close their doors out of arrogance. They close them out of reverence, because they've realized peace is a portal, and not everyone who enters it is ready to see what lies on the other side. And with time, the solitude no longer feels like separation, it feels like sovereignty. It becomes a throne made not of power, but of presence, a sacred space where you no longer crave to be understood, because you have finally understood yourself. You no longer chase validation, because your being has become its own witness. You no longer explain, defend, or negotiate your peace, because you now see that explaining light to those who refuse to open their eyes is just another form of self-betrayal. The spiritually awake know that truth cannot be spoken into deafness. It can only be lived, and when it's lived, it speaks louder than words ever could. This is why the awakened one walks quietly through life, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've realized the futility of saying it to those who are not ready to hear. They've learned the ancient rhythm of sacred timing, that understanding cannot be forced, that transformation cannot be rushed, that awakening cannot be taught, it can only be remembered. When you awaken, you realize that energy itself is the language of existence, that your silence speaks, that your stillness teaches, that your vibration communicates more truth in a glance than your words ever could in an hour. You begin to notice that people who are still asleep don't hear what you say, they hear who you are. They respond to your state of being, not your sentences. And when your energy threatens their illusions, they recoil, misinterpret, attack, or leave. It used to hurt, but now you let them go, not with anger, but with understanding. Because when you awaken, you stop needing people to see you. You start wanting them to see themselves. And sometimes that means letting them walk away. Sometimes it means stepping aside so that their illusions can collapse on their own. Because no truth spoken prematurely survives. It must find its own moment to bloom within another soul. And so the awakened become keepers of quiet revolutions. They don't argue, they embody. They don't convert, they radiate. Their very existence becomes an act of defiance against a world hypnotized by distraction. Their calm becomes a mirror that exposes the collective anxiety of humanity. Their solitude becomes a statement. That power does not come from presence in the crowd, but from presence within the self. Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. That's the silent ache of awakening. You carry wisdom too heavy for small talk, clarity too vast for casual minds. You see patterns others call coincidence. You feel truths others call fantasy. And so, you retreat not because you can't love them, but because you can't lie with them anymore. You can't keep pretending that triviality is fulfilling. You can't keep shrinking your soul to fit inside the smallness of what society calls normal. Your detachment confuses people because they mistake connection for proximity. But real connection is not physical, it's energetic. And the awakened know that distance doesn't end connection any more than closeness guarantees it. They've met people inches away who were galaxies apart, and souls oceans away who felt like home. They've learned that the only true closeness is resonance, the meeting of frequencies that vibrate in harmony. Everything else is noise. That's why the awakened wait before opening their doors. They observe, they feel, they sense the truth of an energy before allowing it into their sacred space. They don't do this out of fear, but out of devotion, devotion to the peace they've fought lifetimes to find. They know how fragile it is, how easily it can be disrupted by the unconsciousness of others, and so they guard it, not with walls, but with awareness, because awareness is the ultimate protection. When you see clearly, deception has no place to hide. When you feel deeply, falsehood cannot survive your presence. You become a frequency that exposes everything untrue, and that exposure makes people uncomfortable. You don't even have to speak. Your stillness becomes their mirror. And the truth is, not everyone wants to see themselves reflected clearly. That's why they leave. That's why they label you distant, aloof, intimidating. They mistake your discernment for judgment. They confuse your boundaries for rejection. But those who are ready, they feel something different. They feel the calm that radiates from you like sunlight through still water. They feel seen without words, understood without explanation, because souls recognize what egos cannot. The more awake you become, the more you understand the sacred geometry of energy, what expands you, what contracts you, what aligns you, what distorts you. You begin to live by vibration, not obligation. You start saying no without guilt and yes without hesitation, because every no that honors your peace is a yes to your soul, and every yes that violates your intuition is a form of self-abandonment. So you choose differently now. You choose stillness over stimulation. You choose depth over distraction. You choose real over popular, peace over company, purpose over comfort. You no longer chase connection, you attract it through authenticity. You no longer need to explain your absence, your energy explains itself. This is the quiet power of those who are awake. They influence without effort. They heal without trying. They teach without speaking, because their presence alone is proof that another way of being is possible. And so they walk lightly, quietly, deliberately, like monks in a noisy marketplace, aware of the chaos but unshaken by it. They move through the world without belonging to it, touching everything but holding nothing. Because to awaken is to understand impermanence, that everything you cling to eventually becomes your cage. So they let go of people, of outcomes, of control, not out of detachment, but out of trust. Trust that what is meant to align will align. Trust that what leaves creates space. Trust that what's real doesn't need to be chased. They have seen enough to know that peace is not found in possession, but in perception. And once perception shifts, life itself becomes different. You see the divine in everything, the lesson in the chaos, the meaning in the mundane, the perfection in the pain. You begin to see how every encounter was energy arranging itself for your awakening. And you start to smile at it all, not because it's easy, but because it's real. That's why the spiritually awake prefer their solitude, because in solitude they can feel that truth uninterrupted. Because in solitude they can hear what life is really saying beneath all the noise. Because in solitude they are closest to the divine rhythm that orchestrates everything unseen. And once you feel that rhythm, once you've danced in the silence of the soul, you don't crave visitors anymore. You crave vibration. You crave presence. You crave that rare, holy resonance between two awake souls who can sit in silence together and still feel seen. That's when you realize you were never meant to dislike visitors. You were simply meant to honor your vibration enough to allow only those who can meet you in peace to enter. And when they do, you won't need to speak much, because in that shared silence, the divine recognizes itself in both of you, and nothing, absolutely nothing, feels more like home. And so the journey comes full circle. The soul that once sought the world's noise now returns to its own silence, not as an escape, but as a throne. Not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. You finally see what the mystics meant when they said to know yourself is to know the universe. Because now, in your solitude, you don't feel small, you feel infinite. You don't feel alone, you feel aligned. You've become the meeting point between the seen and the unseen, between spirit and matter, between chaos and calm. You no longer crave company because you have become communion itself. You no longer seek validation because your being radiates proof. You no longer reach outward for meaning because meaning breathes through you with every heartbeat. You have learned that the divine is not found in temples or teachings. It's found in the quiet awareness that watches it all. And that awareness is you. This is why the awakened seem distant, because they have merged with something vast, something the ordinary mind cannot hold. They are not separate from life. They are dissolved in it. They have stopped trying to change the world and started becoming the vibration that transforms it. They have learned that the greatest influence comes not from speaking louder, but from standing still. Because stillness, when anchored in truth, shakes the universe. You've learned the sacred art of presence, the ability to sit in the center of chaos and remain unmoved, to walk through noise and remain unpolluted. You've learned that your energy is the true conversation. You've learned that peace is not a destination, but a discipline, and that to protect it is to protect the divine spark within all things. Now you move differently. You don't force. You flow. You don't react. You respond. You don't attach. You align. You have become deliberate, every word chosen, every step intentional, every silence sacred. You've turned solitude into ceremony. You've turned simplicity into strength, and when visitors come, when the world knocks, demanding your attention, your energy, your spirit, you greet it not with hostility, but with awareness. You no longer say yes to everything. You say yes only to what resonates. You no longer open your door to everyone. You open it only to those who come in reverence, not need. You no longer dilute your presence for comfort, because you understand that your vibration itself is medicine. You have learned that the spiritually awake do not dislike people, they simply love truth too much to entertain falseness. They do not reject the world, they elevate it by refusing to descend into noise. They do not isolate from humanity, they refine humanity by protecting their frequency. They understand that true connection begins where pretense ends, and that to keep their light pure, they must sometimes walk alone through the shadow. And yet, this aloneness is not empty, it is full, full of stillness, full of meaning, full of the subtle hum of creation itself. You start to realize that you are never truly alone because consciousness accompanies you everywhere. Every gust of wind, every flicker of light, every pulse of breath, all of it is the universe reminding you, I am here and I am you. Jung once said that the one who looks inward awakens, but the one who remains awake must learn to live in the outer world again, not as a prisoner of it, but as a participant in its dream. That is your next initiation, to return to the world, not to get lost in it, but to light it, to speak not to be heard, but to resonate, to act not from desire, but from awareness, to exist as a reminder that peace is possible, that silence is not absence, that solitude is not sorrow. You become a living paradox, both detached and deeply connected, both silent and thunderous, both invisible and radiant, because now you embody the rarest kind of power, the power that does not need to be seen, to be felt. The world may never understand it, but it will feel it in your calm, in your eyes, in the frequency that follows you like invisible light. And so you bow to the mystery, not as a servant, but as an equal. You know now that every breath is a conversation with God. Every still moment is a transmission of truth. Every heartbeat is a sacred drum calling you deeper into yourself. You are not the person you once were, the seeker who begged for answers. You are the answer, remembering itself through form. You are not escaping the world, you are expanding beyond its illusion. You are not hiding from life, you are harmonizing with its rhythm. That is why the spiritually awake don't like visitors, because they have realized that the true visitor is the divine. And it visits in silence, not noise, in solitude, not crowds, in stillness, not chaos. They no longer seek the world's company, because they are keeping company with eternity itself. And as you sit there, in that profound quiet, you realize something. You have not withdrawn from the world. The world has simply fallen silent within you. And in that silence, in that infinite awareness, you finally remember what it means to be untouched, unmoved, awake, and utterly free.